The thunder cracked so hard the lantern on the kitchen table swiveled and nearly tumbled, and little Clara Bailey screamed in a way that split the dark house wide open. She was 5 years old and terrified of storms, had been since the night her mother died in one 2 years prior, and everyone in Caldwell, Kansas knew it. But Raymond Bailey was standing in the barn doorway 30 yards away, soaked to the marrow, his boots sunken 2 inches in mud that the September storm of 1882 had turned the yard into, and he could not move, not 1 inch. Because through the rain-blurred window of his own house, framed by the yellow lantern light, he could see Lydia Garrison on her knees on the kitchen floor, and Clara was folded into her arms so completely that the little girl had nearly disappeared inside the woman's embrace. Lydia's dark hair was loose around her shoulders, her calico dress still dusty from the road she had walked to reach his door that very evening, and she was rocking his youngest daughter back and forth with a steadiness that looked ancient, like she had been doing it all her life, like it was the most natural thing in the world, like that child belonged to her. Raymond Bailey was not a man who was easily undone. He had buried a wife, dragged 3 children across a grief that had no bottom, kept a cattle operation running through drought and drought talk, and the slow economic strangulation that the railroad barons brought every few years when they renegotiated freight rates. He had once stood down a hired gun on the main street of Caldwell without his hands shaking. But watching Lydia Garrison hold his youngest daughter in the lightning-bright dark of his kitchen window, something behind his sternum simply gave way. Cracked clean through. And he stood in the barn doorway with rain pouring off the brim of his hat and felt the whole architecture of his careful, closed-up life buckle under the weight of one woman's tenderness. He did not understand it yet. He would not understand it for weeks. But standing there, undone, Raymond Bailey felt the first thread of something forbidden loosen inside him, something he had promised himself he would never feel again. Something that scared him far more than any hired gun or ruined harvest ever had. Because Lydia Garrison had arrived at his door that evening with a dark past trailing her like smoke, a secret she had not yet told him, and a hidden motive that the gossips of Caldwell had already begun to assign to her with the casual cruelty that small frontier towns specialized in. And Raymond had been warned. By his foreman, by the circuit preacher, by his own older daughter who was 12 and had her mother's suspicious eyes. He had been warned that Lydia Garrison was trouble. He had been warned to keep his door shut. He had not kept his door shut. And now there she was, holding Clara like she was hers to hold, and Raymond Bailey was standing in the rain being utterly, helplessly dismantled. It had started 6 weeks before, on a morning that held none of this storm's fury and all of its complicated promise. The summer of 1882 in Caldwell, Kansas, was the kind of summer that made men philosophical about their choices. The heat came early, pressed down hard, and stayed past its welcome the way certain houseguests do when they know they are not liked. The cattle on Raymond Bailey spread 230 head of longhorn on 1,100 acres south of town, were thinner than he preferred, and the water in the creek that bisected his land had dropped to a level that made him stand at its bank every morning with his thumbs hooked in his belt, and his jaw working silently through calculations he could not afford to get wrong. He was 34 years old. Dark-haired like his children, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who spent their lives in physical labor, with hands that were permanently calloused, and a face that the sun had tanned to the color of old saddle leather. He was not an unkind man, but grief had made him efficient with words and economical with feeling, and most people in Caldwell treated him with the careful respect that the recently bereaved and quietly formidable tend to attract. His wife, Sarah, had died in October of 1880 during a lightning storm, thrown from a horse she had been riding against his advice on a weather-uncertain afternoon. The grief was not something he talked about. It was something he carried in the set of his shoulders, and the way his eyes sometimes fixed on the middle distance during conversations, present in body but briefly absent somewhere else entirely. He had 3 children. Josephine, who was 12 and fierce and startlingly competent, took after her mother in coloring and temperament, and had appointed herself the family's emotional enforcer in the vacuum that grief had created. Thomas, who was 9, was gentle and earnest and spent an alarming amount of time talking to the horses as though they were close personal friends. And Clara, who was 5, who was afraid of thunder, who still sometimes called out for her mother in the night and woke the whole house with the sound of it. Raymond managed all of this. That was the word he used internally. Managed. He did not experience it as living precisely. He managed it, the way you manage a difficult terrain, watching your footing, keeping your balance, not looking too far ahead because the path was uncertain enough underfoot to demand your full attention at close range. It was Josephine who first mentioned Lydia Garrison, not kindly. "Papa," she said one morning at breakfast, her dark eyes above her coffee cup sharp with the kind of intelligence that had always been slightly unsettling in a 12-year-old. "Mrs. Alderman says that woman who bought the Hendersons' old place is a widow from Missouri, and that nobody knows why she left, and that there are stories." "There are always stories," Raymond said without looking up from the ledger he was reviewing over his eggs. "Mrs. Alderman says the stories are not good." "Mrs. Alderman," Raymond said, still not looking up, "has never in her life allowed a fact to interrupt a good story." Josephine had subsided, but her eyes had not. She had her mother's eyes, and she used them the way her mother had, as instruments of precise and slightly uncomfortable observation. Raymond had not thought much about Lydia Garrison after that. He had his own concerns: the water situation, the freight rates, a fence line on the eastern boundary that had been cut twice in the past month, which suggested either a territorial dispute with his neighbor Calhoun, who had always been difficult about the eastern boundary, or something more organized and therefore more troubling. He met her for the first time at the general store on a Thursday morning in early August. He was at the counter discussing a hardware order with old Pete Marsh when the door opened, and a woman came in with the particular self-possessed quality of someone who has already decided they do not care what the room thinks of them. She was medium height, dark-haired, with a face that was striking rather than conventionally pretty, strong jaw, dark brown eyes, a directness of gaze that was unusual enough in a woman in 1882 Caldwell to be immediately noticeable. She was perhaps 29 or 30, wearing a dark blue dress that was clean and well-made but not new, and she moved through the store with the efficiency of someone who had learned not to waste time. Pete Marsh's face did something complicated. He was a sociable man, Pete, the kind who remembered every name and birthday in town, and he had the good manners not to make the complication visible. "Miss Garrison," he said, "the order you requested came in." "Lydia," she said, with a small, definitive correction that made Raymond look at her more carefully. Not Mrs., which meant she had decided to step deliberately out of the widow's designation. Not Miss, which was technically Pete's error since she had been married. Just Lydia. Her name, returned to her by her own preference. She noticed Raymond noticing and met his eyes without flinching, with an equanimity that was almost challenging in its steadiness. "Mr. Bailey," Pete said, with the social helpfulness of a man who loved to introduce people. "Raymond Bailey, Lydia Garrison. She has taken the Henderson place on the West Road." "I know the Henderson place," Raymond said. He was not being unfriendly. He was simply being factual. That was often how he sounded, and he was aware it could read as cool. "I imagine everyone knows every place in a town this size," Lydia said. Not hostile, just equally factual. A small, dry acknowledgement of the same reality. He found himself thinking, unexpectedly, that he had not had a conversation like that wry between equals in a long time. Most people in Caldwell treated him with the particular softness that widowhood attracted, which he understood but found quietly suffocating. "What brings you to Caldwell?" he asked. It was a normal question. Everyone asked it. Something crossed her face. It was brief and controlled, but he had spent 2 years reading controlled faces, his own children's, his foreman's, his own, in mirrors, and he caught it. A slight adjustment, the faint mechanics of a person deciding what version of the truth to give. A fresh start, she said. Missouri had become complicated, complicated. A word that covered a great deal of ground. He knew that too. He nodded, took his hardware receipt from Pete, touched his hat brim to her in the way that passed for social grace in cattle country, and left. He thought about her for the rest of that Thursday in the way you sometimes think about a song you have only heard once, turning it over without intending to, finding it still there when you expected it to be gone. The town's opinion of Lydia Garrison, he gathered over the following 2 weeks without asking, was divided and somewhat heated. The women were cautious, which in frontier towns meant they circulated information with the efficiency of a telegraph line, each station adding its own interpretation. The stories were this: that Lydia Garrison had been married to a man named Cole Garrison in Jefferson City, Missouri. That Cole Garrison had died under circumstances that were described variously as an accident, a dispute, and something darker depending on who was telling it. That Lydia had left Missouri quickly after and come to Kansas with money enough to buy the Henderson property but not enough to make her comfortable without working. That she had no family with her, no references, and no apparent explanation for why she had chosen Caldwell specifically. None of this, Raymond noted, was actually damning. It was simply incomplete, and incomplete stories in small frontier towns have a way of filling themselves in with the worst available material. He ran into her 3 more times over the following 2 weeks. Once on the main street, where she was carrying a load that was clearly too heavy for one person, and he took half of it without asking and carried it to her wagon, because his mother had raised him to do that regardless of whether the woman in question wanted his opinion about her situation. She thanked him with a briskness that was not unfriendly. Once at the church social, where she sat slightly apart from the main cluster of women, with the particular dignity of someone who has decided not to perform the desire for belonging. And once, the one that stayed with him at the edge of the river on a Sunday afternoon, where he had gone alone because he sometimes needed to be alone and she had apparently needed the same thing, and they had both arrived at the same flat rock at the river bend, and stood there for an awkward moment before she laughed. It was a small laugh, surprised out of her, and it changed her face entirely, made her younger and less defended and more genuinely herself. He felt something shift in his chest in a way he had not felt in 2 years and immediately mistrusted it. "I can go," she offered. "You were here first," he said. "How do you know? Your footprints come from the east path." "Mine from the west. The east path is shorter from town, so you arrived first." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not fully read, half amused, half something more thoughtful. "You read sign. I cattle ranch. You learned to read sign." She sat down on the flat rock, which he had not expected, and after a moment he sat on the far end of it. The river made its sound. The cottonwoods shook their silver leaves in the slight breeze that the river always generated even in dead summer. They sat in silence for a while, which should have been awkward and was not. "I'm not what they're saying," she said eventually, not defensively, "the way you might state a compass bearing. Here is where we actually are. I haven't asked what they're saying. You've heard it." "I've heard various things," he said carefully. "Frontier towns specialize in filling in blanks." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the water. "My husband Cole was not a good man," she said. "He was charming and he was not a good man. Those 2 things can coexist and they're more dangerous together than either one alone." Another pause. "He made enemies. One of those enemies took care of the problem for me, which I was not unhappy about, which is the part that the stories twist into something more sinister than it was. I did not arrange it. I was not unhappy it happened." "Those are 2 different things." Raymond sat with this. It was the most direct account of a complicated situation he had heard in some time. He respected the directness even though the content was unsettling, and even though he recognized that he was only hearing her version of it. "And why Caldwell?" he asked. She turned and looked at him, and there was something in her eyes that was closer to vulnerable than anything he had seen from her yet. It was far enough, she said simply. And it looked like somewhere a person might be able to start again if the town let them. The question of whether the town would let her hung between them, unaddressed. They both knew the answer was uncertain. They sat there another 20 minutes, talking about smaller things, the summer's heat, the water situation, whether the Henderson property's well was deep enough to be reliable through drought. She knew more about wells than he would have expected, and he said so, and she told him that her family in Missouri had run a small farm before she married, and that she had learned early which knowledge was worth keeping. There was an ease to talking with her that was unexpected, and that he walked home from the river slightly troubled by, because ease was not something he had anticipated, and he did not entirely know what to do with it. The trouble with his eastern fence line escalated in mid-August. 3 posts were pulled entirely, not cut, which suggested a more deliberate operation than a casual trespasser, and one morning he found cattle missing 6 head, which was not catastrophic but was a clear message. His foreman, Jim Carver, a weathered, loyal man of 45 who had been with Raymond since before Sarah died, said quietly that he had heard Calhoun had been talking to some people from Wichita about the eastern acreage, and that those people were the kind who solved property disputes with methods that did not involve courts. Raymond rode to Calhoun's property that afternoon and had a conversation with Calhoun that was polite on the surface and entirely clear underneath. He told Calhoun that he was aware of the fence situation, that he did not intend to sell or cede the eastern acreage, and that if any further interference occurred, he would be filing with the county sheriff and would be prepared to take whatever subsequent action the situation required. Calhoun, who was a big red-faced man with a talent for pretending misunderstanding, denied everything with an affability that convinced neither of them. Raymond rode home knowing the issue was not resolved, only paused. He did not tell Josephine about the fence situation, because Josephine worried with an intensity that was exhausting even when the worry was warranted. He told Jim to keep watch and to make sure the hands were aware without creating alarm. He went back to managing. It was during this same week that Lydia Garrison came to him, voluntarily, with information. She arrived at his ranch gate on a weekday afternoon, on foot because she did not yet have a horse, a deficit she addressed with a practical unself-consciousness that was becoming recognizable as her particular style, and she asked to speak with him privately. He took her to the porch, where the privacy was relative but better than the yard, and sent Thomas inside with a look that communicated clearly. "I don't know if this is my business," she said, standing on his porch with her hands clasped in front of her in a way that suggested she was controlling a nervousness she did not want to show. "But I think you should know that 2 men have been on the road east of my property 3 mornings running. They camp overnight near the creek bend. I don't know who they are, but they're watching your eastern pasture." He was very still for a moment. "Did they see you?" "No, I know how to be unseen when I want to be." He believed her. He did not examine too carefully why he believed her. "I'm grateful," he said. "It's not a favor," she said, with a precision that made him look at her sharply. "I mean, I did not do it for obligation. I noticed something that seemed like it could be dangerous for you, and I thought you should know. That's all it is." The distinction she was drawing, that it was not a favor, not an investment in his gratitude, just a simple human decision to tell a neighbor what she had seen, struck him as unusually honest. Most people, even well-intentioned ones, offered information with some invisible accounting underneath it. She was explicitly declining the accounting. "Well," he said, and he heard the inadequacy of it. "Thank you, Lydia." It was the first time he had used her name, the first name the way she had given it. She noticed. He could tell she noticed by the brief and very controlled stillness that passed over her face, and then she nodded briskly and walked back down the gate road. He watched her go longer than was entirely sensible, and then went inside and stared at his kitchen wall for a moment before he remembered what he was supposed to be doing. The information she had given him turned out to be correct and important. The 2 men camped at the creek bend were hired by Calhoun, as Raymond had suspected, and Jim and 2 of the hands ran them off the land and recovered the 6 missing cattle from where they had been penned in a dry wash 3 miles east. The county sheriff was notified. Calhoun's hired men gave enough information to make Calhoun's position uncomfortable, and the eastern boundary dispute entered a formal legal phase that Raymond was confident he would eventually win, though not quickly. He went to the Henderson place, Lydia's place, the following Saturday, with a jar of honey from the 2 hives he kept near the south pasture. He told himself it was a neighborly gesture. He stood at her door aware that he was holding a jar of honey with somewhat more significance than a jar of honey usually warranted. She opened the door, saw him, looked at the honey and said, "You did not have to do that." "I know." She stood back and let him in. Her house was spare and clean, with the evidence of a woman making a home out of very little. A good table that she had clearly refinished herself. Curtains made from flower sacking that were functional and quietly lovely in an unsentimental way. Books, more books than he expected, arranged on a rough shelf that was also clearly her own work. A kitchen that smelled of the bread she had apparently been baking. She gave him coffee, which was a significant offering in 1882 given the price of it, and they sat at her table, and the conversation that followed was the longest they had yet had, and moved through territory that was increasingly personal. He told her about the fence situation and the resolution of it, and watched her face when he mentioned that her information had been crucial, and she received this with a simple nod that was neither falsely modest nor self-congratulatory. He told her, without quite knowing why he was telling her, that Sarah had died 2 years ago. She said that she was sorry. He said that he appreciated that, and that most condolences at 2 years out felt performative, but that hers did not. She asked why. "Because you said it once and then moved on," he said. "People who feel sorry usually say it and wait for you to reassure them that you're fine. You didn't wait." She thought about this. "I don't need you to reassure me," she said. "You don't owe me comfort about your own grief." He looked at her across the table and thought involuntarily that Sarah would have liked her. It was the kind of thought that came with a small, sharp edge. He put it away carefully. He came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. He found reasons, some of them legitimate and some of them that required small creative efforts. He helped her with a section of roof that was questionable. He brought Thomas once, who immediately found her small garden fascinating and asked 17 questions about the squash, which she answered with the patient thoroughness of someone who actually enjoyed being asked 17 questions about squash. Josephine did not come. Josephine, who had her mother's eyes and her mother's sharp instincts, was watching this from a distance with an expression Raymond found difficult to read and was not ready to press her on. Clara came on the 3rd visit because Clara went where Thomas went, and Thomas went where Raymond went since Jim was minding the ranch. Clara was shy, which was her default with new people, and she stood near Raymond's leg for the first 20 minutes while Lydia moved through the kitchen making lemonade, actual lemonade, from lemons that she had arranged to have brought from Wichita on the weekly freight wagon, a small, deliberate luxury that felt to Raymond like another piece of the puzzle of who she was, and said nothing. Lydia did not push. She did not crouch down and perform friendliness the way some women did, the exaggerated brightness that children saw straight through. She simply moved through her kitchen, set a glass of lemonade on the edge of the table where Clara could reach it if she chose, and continued talking to Raymond about the water situation, as though Clara's eventual approach was simply a given that did not require management. Clara approached the lemonade glass in stages, like a very small and cautious diplomat negotiating a complicated treaty. Lydia glanced at her once, just once, with a warmth that was genuine and contained, not performing itself, and then looked back at Raymond and continued what she was saying about the drainage on her east property. Clara drank the lemonade. And then, because Lydia's kitchen had a calico cat that appeared from nowhere in the way that calico cats specialized in, Clara forgot to be shy entirely and spent the rest of the visit on the kitchen floor negotiating with the cat in a whispered monologue while the adults talked. Going home in the wagon, Thomas said, "I like her," with the unguarded directness of 9. Raymond kept his eyes on the road and said, "She seems like a good person. Are we going to go back?" "We may." Thomas seemed satisfied with this. Clara was asleep against Raymond's arm with her thumb near her mouth, not quite in it, which was a habit she was in the slow process of outgrowing, and the weight of her against his side was its own particular communication. He looked at the road ahead and felt the edge of something he was not yet ready to name. September came with the storms. The plains in September could do this. After a summer of grinding heat, the atmosphere reorganized itself with a violence that felt almost punitive, rolling in from the west in the late afternoons, with a darkness that turned the sky green at the edges and brought thunder that shook the window glass in its frames. Clara's fear of storms was rooted in the storm the night her mother died, and no amount of gentle explanation from Raymond had been able to separate the storm itself from what the storm represented to a 5-year-old's understanding of cause and effect. Thunder happened, and then her world had changed catastrophically. So thunder happened, and Clara shook. Josephine could handle it when she was home, because Josephine's fierce protectiveness of her younger siblings extended to physically placing herself between them and whatever frightened them. But Josephine had gone to stay 3 nights with the Alderman girls for reasons that mostly involved a particular interest in the Alderman family's piano, which Josephine was learning to play, and Thomas was developing the 9-year-old boy's complicated relationship with fear, where he simultaneously wanted to comfort his sister and not appear to be frightened himself, which generally produced a kind of paralyzed hovering. The storm that came on the 4th of September came fast and came hard. Raymond had seen it building on the western horizon since mid-afternoon and had pushed to get the cattle moved before it hit, and he and Jim and 2 of the hands had managed it, but barely. The rain came in while they were still bringing the last of the horses into the barn, and within 10 minutes the yard was a river, and the lightning was throwing the whole landscape into a momentary daylight that had nothing kind in it. He had sent Thomas to get Clara and stay inside, and he had stayed in the barn making sure the animals were secure, and the barn door would hold against what was becoming a serious wind. He was soaked. He was cold, the way you get cold in September storms where the temperature drops 20 degrees in an hour. He was going to get back to the house as soon as he was certain the barn was secure, and he was not certain yet. And then in the next lightning flash, he saw a figure come through his front gate, small, moving fast, head down against the rain, coming up the path to his front door. He did not know then that it was Lydia. He did not know until later that she had been returning from town on the west road when the storm hit, and that instead of retreating to her own house, which was farther and in the opposite direction from the wind, she had made the decision in the way she apparently made all decisions, quickly and without excessive deliberation, to come to his house because his house was closer, and because she had been thinking about Clara and storms and had, she told him later, without any sentimentality about it, simply wanted to make sure Clara was all right. He was still in the barn, watching the house, when the door opened to admit the figure, and through the rain-blurred window he could see the interior of his kitchen illuminated by the lantern. And then the thunder hit. Not the ambient rolling kind, but the concussive crack of a bolt that was close, very close, close enough to feel. And from inside the house he heard Clara scream, the particular scream of total terror, the one that had no reasoning available to it, the one that was just the raw animal fear of a child in the dark. And he saw Lydia move. Not with the hesitation of someone in a strange house, not with the uncertainty of someone navigating unfamiliar space, but with the instinct of someone who simply knew what needed doing. She crossed his kitchen in 3 strides and he lost her from the window angle, and then the next lightning flash showed him what he had not expected to see. She was on the kitchen floor, and Clara was in her arms. Folded into them, entirely enclosed, Lydia's arms around her and her dark hair falling forward over the child and her whole body arranged as a shelter, a containment, a fortress against whatever the thunder was trying to say. And she was rocking. And even through the rain on the window glass and the distance of 30 yards of storm-soaked yard, he could see that Clara's screaming had stopped. Raymond Bailey stood in the doorway of his barn and felt something in him that had been sealed for 2 years break open with a completeness that nothing he had done deliberately had achieved. Not grief counseling from the circuit preacher, not the methodical work of running a ranch, not even the careful, incremental process of watching his children grow and manage and survive. Years of managed everything and Lydia Garrison on his kitchen floor in a stranger's house in a storm, holding his youngest like it was simply what you did, what you always did, what there was no question about doing, and he was undone, standing in the rain in the dark, completely and irrevocably undone. He did not go into the house immediately. He stood in the barn doorway for another full minute, rain dripping off his hat brim in a steady curtain, and he let himself feel it, all of it. The longing and the terror of the longing, and the certainty that he was in dangerous territory, and the equal and opposite certainty that he had been in dangerous territory since a Thursday morning at Pete Marsh's general store, and had simply been too careful and too managed to admit it. Then he crossed the yard in the rain and went into his own house. She was still on the kitchen floor when he came in, the door letting in a gust of wet air that made the lantern shudder. Clara was no longer screaming. Clara was tucked under Lydia's chin with her fists wrapped in Lydia's dress, still trembling finely, and Lydia was making a sound low in her throat, not quite humming, not quite words, just a continuous sound like the river made, like something that was old and steady and would not stop. Thomas was at the kitchen table with his knees drawn up on the chair, watching with large eyes, and he looked at Raymond coming in wet and muddy and enormous in the doorway, and some of the tension went out of his small shoulders. Lydia looked up at Raymond. Her hair was wet from the rain she had come through, dark and loose, her dress damp at the shoulders, and her eyes when they met his were steady and without apology and without performance. She simply looked at him the way she always looked at him, as an equal, clearly, directly, seeing what was there. "She's all right," Lydia said, quietly so as not to disturb the fragile calm she had built around Clara. "She was very frightened. She's settling." Raymond could not speak for a moment. He could not trust what his voice would do. He cleared his throat and said, "Thank you." And then, because it was insufficient by miles, and he could not address that in front of his children, he said, "You're soaked. I'll make coffee." He made coffee. His hands moved through the familiar motions of the kitchen while behind him Lydia continued to hold Clara on the floor, and the thunder continued its performance outside, gradually moving east, the intervals between lightning and thunder lengthening in the way that meant the worst of it was passing. Thomas came down off his chair and went to sit near Lydia's knee, not touching, just near, which was his way of offering and receiving comfort simultaneously. Eventually, Clara fell asleep. She was 5 and exhausted from fear, and sleep took her suddenly the way it does with small children, like a switch. Lydia held her for another few minutes to make sure, and then looked up at Raymond, who had brought her coffee and was sitting at the table watching with an expression he was not managing very well. "Can you take her?" Lydia said. He crossed the floor, crouched down, and lifted Clara with the practiced ease of a man who had been lifting this particular child since she was born. Clara made a small, trusting sound against his shoulder and sank back into sleep. He carried her to her room and put her in her bed and stood looking at her for a moment in the diminishing thunder, her face smooth and unknowing in sleep, one fist curled near her cheek. He stood there a little too long. When he came back to the kitchen, Lydia was at the table with her coffee, and Thomas had apparently said something that made her smile, because she was still smiling when Raymond appeared in the doorway. And it hit him again, that smile, like the first time by the river but harder, because now it was in his kitchen, in his house, in the place where his life actually lived. He sat down across from her and they drank coffee while the storm outside softened to an ordinary rain, and Thomas eventually went to bed because Raymond told him to, and then it was just the two of them at the table in the kitchen with the lantern light and the quiet. "You came through the storm," he said, "to check on Clara." "I was on the West Road," she said, "and the storm came fast and I thought about her." "You didn't have to." She looked at him across the table. "I know I didn't have to." He held her gaze and felt the full weight of everything he had been not saying for 6 weeks pressing against the inside of his ribs. He was not a man who made speeches. He was not built for eloquence, but the words that came out of him then were not a speech. They were just the truth said plainly because that was how both of them seemed to operate, and he was done managing this. "I think about you every day," he said. "I have since August. I have been telling myself various sensible things about why this is complicated, and I no longer find any of them convincing." The kitchen was very quiet. Rain tapped at the window. The lantern burned steadily. Lydia set her coffee cup down with a small, deliberate movement and looked at him with an expression that was complicated and honest, which was the only kind of expression she seemed to have. "I should tell you something," she said. "All right. The stories about Cole," she said. "They aren't entirely wrong." He waited. "He was not a good man," she said again, the same words she had used at the river. "And he had enemies. And one of those enemies was a man who had decided that I was the way to get to Cole, and when Cole died, that man, his name is Merritt Hale, decided that what I knew about Cole's business dealings made me a liability rather than a widow." She looked at her hands. "I left Missouri because Merritt Hale told me that it would be healthier for me to do so. I have been watching my back for a year. I chose Caldwell because it was small enough that I would see a stranger arriving before they arrived, and far enough from Jefferson City that a man with Hale's resources might decide the travel wasn't worth it." She looked back up at him. "I am telling you this because you should know what standing near me might mean. It is not a simple thing, and you have children." The silence that followed had weight. Raymond turned this over carefully, the way he turned over fence repairs and water calculations, looking at the actual structure of it. "Is Hale coming?" he asked. "I don't know," she said. "It has been 6 months since I left. I have heard nothing, but I don't know. What does he want?" "Cole kept records," she said carefully. "Business records that documented things that would be damaging to Hale. I know where those records are. I did not take them because they were dangerous to carry. I left them where they were, and I told Hale that I had and that I would not pursue them. He may believe me or he may not." Raymond was quiet for a long moment. "And do you have any intention of pursuing them?" She looked at him steadily. "No, I want to be done with everything that Cole was, all of it. I want to plant a garden and learn this land and be left alone, and eventually, if this town will let me, to belong somewhere." A pause. "That is the whole truth. I have not told it to anyone else because I was not sure whose confidence I could trust. I am telling you because you asked me something honest and you should have an honest answer." Raymond looked at her for a long time. The rain was almost quiet now. The storm had moved on. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "I'm not going to pretend that's not a complicated situation, but I'm also not going to pretend that it changes what I said before." She blinked. It was the first time he had seen her genuinely surprised. "You think about me every day," she said carefully, as though testing the weight of it. "Every day," he confirmed. No elaboration, no qualification, just the fact of it. She looked at him for a long moment and then she said, very quietly, "I think about you too." He drove her home in the wagon in the aftermath of the storm, because the roads were bad and the night was dark and she had walked to his house, and he was not going to let her walk back. The drive was 20 minutes in the mud, the horses picking their careful way, and they did not talk much, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who have said something significant and are allowing it to settle. At her gate, he helped her down from the wagon. It was practical. The mud was everywhere, and for a moment her hand was in his. Her hand was not small. It was a working woman's hand, strong with calluses at the palm, and it fit against his in a way that made him hold it a moment longer than necessary. She let him hold it a moment longer than necessary. "I'll come by tomorrow," he said. "If that's all right." "It's all right," she said. He drove home in the dark with the mud sound under the wheels and the wet smell of the aftermath of storm in the air, and he was aware that he was smiling. It had been a long time since he was aware of smiling without being aware of the strangeness of it, the foreign quality of it. This did not feel foreign. This felt, frighteningly and entirely, like something real. He told Josephine the next morning before he went to Lydia's. He told her the way he told her most important things directly, without softening it past the point of honesty, respecting her enough to give her the full truth. "I'm going to be spending more time with Lydia Garrison," he said. "I want to know how you feel about that." Josephine looked at him across the breakfast table with her mother's eyes. 12 years old, already so like Sarah in the architecture of her thought, needing to process before she spoke, refusing to react purely from emotion because emotion felt to her like a loss of control. "I don't know her," Josephine said finally. "I know, I would like you to. Mrs. Alderman says, what do you think?" Raymond said. "Not Mrs. Alderman, you." Josephine was quiet. She looked at her plate. "I think you are different when you talk about her," she said carefully. "You are more present. You have been not present for a long time." She pushed a piece of biscuit around her plate. "I don't know if I like her. I think I need to know her to know if I like her." "That's fair," Raymond said. "It's entirely fair." He went to Lydia's. He went the next day and the day after. October came in and the weather settled into the golden, stable beauty that the Kansas plains could produce in autumn. The grass cured to amber, the sky a blue so clear it seemed structural, and the morning rides to the Henderson place became part of the rhythm of Raymond's days in a way that felt both natural and enormous. He kissed her for the first time in the third week of October. It was not planned. They were standing at her garden fence in the late afternoon, discussing something ordinary. He could not afterward remember exactly what. And she had turned to look at something in the field, and he was looking at her profile, and he thought, with a clarity that felt like falling, that he was entirely in love with her. And when she turned back and found him looking and opened her mouth to ask what he was staring at, he kissed her instead. It was brief and careful, and when he pulled back she was looking at him with her brown eyes wide, and then she laughed, that surprised laugh from the river, and then she kissed him back, which was less brief and considerably less careful. He rode home that evening in the amber autumn dusk, feeling 22 years old and mildly insane, and completely, recklessly glad. Josephine met Lydia properly in November. At a dinner Raymond arranged with the careful diplomacy of a man who understood that his daughter's approval mattered to him in ways he was not going to override, but also was not going to let indefinitely defer. He asked Lydia to dinner, told her that Josephine would be there and what that meant, and Lydia said with characteristic directness, "I understand. She should form her own opinion. I won't try to manage it." The dinner was somewhat cautious at the beginning. Josephine was polite in the way that intelligent children are polite when they are reserving judgment, which is not entirely comfortable for anyone. She asked Lydia several questions that were more searching than their surface suggested about Missouri, about what Lydia was planning to do with the Henderson land, about what she knew about cattle, and Lydia answered all of them without performing and without obvious strategy, simply honestly and specifically, including saying, "I don't know," on the cattle question with a directness that Josephine's eyes responded to before the rest of her face did. The turning point came when Josephine, for reasons that 12-year-olds sometimes have that are not fully explicable, asked Lydia about her books. They were in the parlor after dinner. Josephine had apparently noticed, on the one visit to Lydia's house she had made with Raymond, the books on the rough shelf. Lydia talked about them without performing an interest in impressing Josephine, the way she might talk about them to a contemporary, and Josephine's face opened by degrees the way a window admits increasing light. Lydia had opinions about books, strong ones. She had read George Eliot and found the social observation forensically accurate. She had read Cooper and found him romantically misleading about the frontier. She had an ancient, much-read copy of Jane Eyre that she had carried from Missouri wrapped in her extra dress, and she spoke of it with the particular warmth of a book that had accompanied you through difficult passages of life. Josephine had Jane Eyre too in her room, given to her by her mother. She looked at Lydia for a long moment when this emerged, and then she said, very quietly, "My mother loved that book." And Lydia said, equally quietly, "Tell me about her." Raymond watched his daughter's face and saw the moment that Josephine made a choice. She could have closed. She had the mechanism for it. She had inherited it from both parents. Instead, she opened, fractionally, the way a door opens when you stop holding it shut. She told Lydia about Sarah. Small things, specific things, the particular texture of her mother, how she had smelled of lavender and wood smoke, how she had been fierce about handwriting and gentle about most everything else, how she had loved the horses in a way that ultimately, terribly, contributed to her death, and how Josephine was not angry at the horses about it, which had required some internal work. Lydia listened. She did not say consoling things. She asked careful questions. She was present in the way that good listeners are present, with their whole attention. After that evening, Josephine did not become warmly enthusiastic. She was not built for warmth on a fast schedule, but she was fair. And fair, from Josephine, was meaningful. The question of Merritt Hale, which Raymond had filed away in the part of his mind where he kept threats that required monitoring, came back to the surface in November. Jim Carver came to him one morning with a face that was doing its controlled thing, and said that he had seen a man in town the previous evening who did not belong there, who was asking questions at the saloon about the Henderson property and the woman who had bought it. The man had given no name. He had paid for his information with coin and left before anyone thought to ask him his business. Raymond's stomach did what it did when something was actually dangerous, which was settle with a cold precision, all the unnecessary things draining out of it. He went to Lydia that morning. He sat at her kitchen table and told her what Jim had said and watched her face do the thing it did when she was afraid, not flinching, not breaking, just going very still, the way a deer goes still, every sense extended. "It could be Hale's man," she said, "or it could be coincidence." She paused. "It is probably not coincidence." "No," he agreed. "I should leave," she said. It was not self-pity. It was the flat assessment of someone who has thought through this scenario before. "If he's following me, staying here puts everyone around me in danger. I should—" "No," Raymond said. She looked at him. "I'm not asking you to leave," he said. "I'm asking you to be careful and to let me help." "Raymond, I have resources you don't have," he said. "I know this county, I know the sheriff, I know these roads, and I have Jim and 4 other men who know how to handle a threat." He looked at her directly. "You have been handling this alone for a year. You do not have to handle it alone." She was very still across the table from him. Her eyes had that vulnerability he had learned to look for, the thin seam in the controlled surface, the place where the real Lydia was visible underneath the capable one. "This is not your problem," she said. "You are not a problem," he said carefully. "You are someone I love. That is a different category entirely." The word landed between them. He had not said it before. He watched her receive it and watched it move through her and watched her eyes fill briefly with something. She then blinked back with the discipline of a woman who had trained herself against public feeling, except that this was not public. It was his kitchen table, and she did not quite manage to blink it back entirely. "You love me," she said, testing it, making sure she had heard correctly. "Yes," he said. No elaboration, just the same plain fact as before. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I love you too." And she said it with the careful directness of someone who has not said the words in a long time and is making sure they are true before she says them, and then, having confirmed it, saying them completely. They sat with that for a moment, the kitchen quiet around them, November light coming pale and clean through the window. Then Raymond said, "Now, tell me everything you know about Merritt Hale." She told him. All of it this time, the full account, not the compressed version she had given before. Hale was a land speculator, an extortionist operating out of Jefferson City, connected to certain political interests that gave him informal protection from legal consequence. Cole had worked as something between a business agent and an enforcer for Hale's operation, before turning against him over a dispute about money, the details of which Raymond gathered were complicated and not particularly to Cole's credit. The records Cole had kept were in a strongbox at a bank in Jefferson City, with a sealed letter of instruction that Cole had told Lydia about and Lydia had told Hale about, because she had calculated correctly that knowledge of their existence without possession of them was safer than silence. "If Hale sends someone here," Raymond said, "what does he want?" "My silence," she said. "And possibly confirmation that I don't have copies of what's in that strongbox." A pause. "I don't, but he doesn't know that for certain." Could those records be used against Hale legally, she considered, if they reached the right people, but the right people are not in Caldwell, Kansas. They would need to be in Jefferson City or possibly St. Louis, and someone would need to be willing to pursue it. Raymond was quiet, thinking. Then he said, "I know a man. He is a federal attorney in Topeka who I have done some business with regarding the railroad rate case. He has an interest in extortion operations connected to political corruption. He has told me so directly." He looked at her. "If I contact him about this, it becomes a different kind of conversation." She stared at him. "You would do that?" "I would do that," he confirmed. "Raymond, that is, I said I would help," he said simply. "I meant I would help." He wrote to Henry Foss, the federal attorney in Topeka, that same week. The letter was careful and specific, containing enough detail to be credible and enough restraint to be appropriate for a first correspondence. He sent it with the Wichita-bound mail and waited. In the meantime, the man Jim had seen in Caldwell appeared once more, spotted by Raymond himself on the main street on a Wednesday. A compact, dark-eyed man in a town coat who was clearly not a cowhand, and was watching the West Road with a patience that was professional. And Raymond went directly to Sheriff Dale Prout and had a quiet, specific conversation. Prout, who was a capable man if not a remarkable one, took the information seriously and increased his own awareness without creating a public disturbance. The man disappeared from town 2 days later. Whether he had accomplished his purpose or been discouraged by the sheriff's increased presence, Raymond could not know. He told Lydia, and she was not reassured, but she was steadier. Having someone beside her in this, he observed, made a visible difference in her. Not that she depended on him, not that she had transferred her self-sufficiency to his keeping, but that she was simply not carrying the weight alone, and alone had been making the weight heavier than it needed to be. Henry Foss responded to Raymond's letter in December with the efficiency of a man who recognized the value of what he was being offered. He was very interested. He had been building a case against Hale's operation for 2 years and had been missing a key avenue of corroboration. The records Cole had kept, if they were what Lydia described, could be the foundation of a federal prosecution. He asked for a meeting. Raymond discussed it with Lydia at her kitchen table on a cold December evening with snow on the ground outside and the fire built high, and they went through it together the way they went through everything together by now, as people who had made a habit of thinking alongside each other. "If you cooperate with Foss," Raymond said, "it resolves the threat. Hale loses his reason to pursue you once his operation is exposed. You are not the risk anymore, he is. It also means being visible," she said. "Testimony, my name attached to it officially." "Yes." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. He watched her think, this woman who thought carefully and bravely and without self-deception. "It's the right thing to do," she said finally. "For the people Cole and Hale hurt, not just for me." She looked at him. "I'll meet with Foss." The meeting happened in January in Topeka, which meant a 2-day journey that Raymond accompanied her on, because he was not going to let her make the trip alone, and she did not argue with him about it. It was the first significant time they had spent traveling together, and it had the intimacy of that close quarters, long hours in the train car, conversations that went deeper than kitchen table evenings allowed, meals in hotel dining rooms where they were clearly a couple in a way that mattered to him more than he expected. Henry Foss was a sharp, gray-haired man who treated Lydia with the professional respect of someone who understood exactly what she was bringing to him and what it had cost her to bring it. The meeting lasted most of a day, and Raymond was not present for all of it. Some of it was between Lydia and Foss alone, as it needed to be. But when Lydia came out of that final hour with Foss, she had the particular quality of someone who has set down something very heavy that they have been carrying for a long time. On the train back to Caldwell, she leaned against his shoulder in the dark and said nothing for a long time, and he put his arm around her and looked out the window at the Kansas winter moving past in the dark. "It's over," she said quietly. "Or it will be. He said the case will take time, but he has what he needs." "Then it's over," Raymond said. "I have been afraid for a year," she said. It was a statement of fact, not complaint. "I had almost forgotten what it felt like not to be afraid." He held her a little tighter. She put her hand on his chest over his heartbeat in a gesture that was not calculated, just instinctive, and he felt her breathing slow and steady into the rhythm of it. When they returned to Caldwell, Raymond Bailey spoke to the circuit preacher about the availability of the church and the requirements of the process. He was not an impetuous man, and he was not romantic in the florid sense, but he had arrived somewhere in that January train, and he knew where he was, and he was not going to wait for a more convenient moment, because he had learned that convenient moments required manufacture. He asked Lydia to marry him on a February afternoon, at the flat rock by the river where they had first properly talked. The river was half frozen, running dark and quick between ice-edged banks, and the cottonwoods were bare, and his breath made clouds in the cold air. He did not get down on one knee, which would have required kneeling in mud and ice and been undignified to the point of distraction. He simply took her hands, both of them, her working hands with their familiar calluses, and said, "I want to marry you. I want you in my house and in my life, and I want you to be with my children, if you'll have that." Lydia looked at him in the cold February air, and her eyes were bright in the way that was not crying but was adjacent to it, and she said, "I'll have that, all of that. Yes." They were married in April, when the Kansas spring was doing its complicated negotiation between winter's reluctance and the growing season's insistence, and the ceremony was at the small white church in Caldwell, with the preacher and 40 or so of the town's residents, some of whom had arrived at a more generous opinion of Lydia Garrison over the winter, and some of whom were simply too curious to stay away. It did not matter to Raymond which reason they had come. Lydia wore a dress that was not white. She had no pretensions on that front, but was a deep green that made her look herself and not a performance of someone else. She walked into that church with the self-possessed quality that he had first noticed in Pete Marsh's store, and stood beside him at the altar, and said what she meant in a voice that did not shake. Thomas cried a little, which he denied afterward, and Clara fell asleep during the final prayer because she was 5 and had been promised cake, and the delay was unreasonable. Josephine did not cry. She stood very straight, in a new dress that Raymond had brought from Wichita specifically for this occasion, and she watched Lydia with those careful, intelligent eyes. And at the end, when the preacher had done his part and Raymond and Lydia turned from the altar, Josephine was the one who stepped forward first. She took Lydia's hand with a formality that was so precisely Josephine proper, chosen, meaning something without explaining itself, and said, "Welcome to our family." Lydia looked at Josephine, and something in her face that was usually held at a professional distance arrived fully, openly, and without management. "Thank you," she said. And she meant it in a way that carried the full weight of what Josephine's welcome cost a 12-year-old girl who had been protecting her family since she was 10. The spring of 1883 had a quality that Raymond had not experienced in some time and could only describe as full. The ranch was doing better. The eastern boundary dispute had resolved in his favor by February, and with Calhoun's hired troublemakers gone, the cattle had expanded into the eastern pasture as intended, increasing the operation's capacity. Lydia was, She was simply everywhere in the house, which was the only way to put it. She was a presence the way a fire is a presence, providing heat and light and a center around which other things organized. She learned the ranch, not performatively, not to please him, but because she was genuinely interested in the systems of it and learned quickly and directly. By summer, she could assess cattle condition with a knowledgeable eye. She had reorganized the household accounts with an efficiency that Jim admired out loud, which from Jim was significant. She had planted a real garden at the ranch house and expanded it beyond what the Henderson property had carried vegetables and herbs, and in the sheltered south corner, an attempt at flowers that Thomas helped tend with the earnest thoroughness he brought to everything botanical. She and Josephine found their way to each other slowly and genuinely. It was never easy in the quick, smooth way of things that don't mean much. It was the kind of difficult that things are when they mean a great deal. Josephine was working out what it meant to love someone who was not her mother, and Lydia was working out what it meant to mother someone who was not hers by birth, and neither of them was going to pretend those things were simple. But they talked. At the kitchen table in the evenings, over the books they had both read and the ones they hadn't. Lydia did not try to fill Sarah's place. She was very clear in her own mind about that, and it showed, not in what she said but in what she did not say, in the space she left, in the way she listened when Josephine talked about her mother without needing to position herself in relation to that conversation. Henry Foss's case against Merritt Hale moved through the federal system with the grinding patience of legal processes, and in the summer of 1883, Lydia received a letter from Foss informing her that Hale had been indicted on multiple counts of extortion and conspiracy. The trial was scheduled for the following spring. She would likely not need to testify in person. Foss had built the case strongly enough on the documentary evidence, but she should be available for correspondence. She read this letter at the kitchen table on a July morning with Raymond across from her and the summer light coming gold and generous through the window, and then she set the letter down and looked at him and said, "It's done." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. "It's done," he agreed. She turned her hand under his and held it, and outside the window the summer went on doing what summer did, the cattle moving in the distance, the cottonwoods by the creek showing their undersides in the breeze, everything turning and growing and as it should be. In September of 1883, a full year after the storm that had first undone him, Lydia told him she was pregnant. She told him on the porch in the evening, with the western sky the complicated color it sometimes turned in September, amber and rose, and a purple that seemed improbable but was real. She told him the way she told him things, directly and without preamble, watching his face for his reaction with the steadiness that was entirely hers. He took a long breath and felt something happen in his chest that was so large it was beyond what words could usefully address. He stood up from his porch chair and pulled her up and held her, just held her, in the September evening with the complicated sky, and she put her face against his shoulder, and they stood there for a while in the particular silence of two people for whom this is, in fact, everything. They told the children at dinner. Clara was thrilled in the unguarded way of 6-year-olds for whom a baby was a simple and uncomplicated delight. Thomas asked several technical questions that Raymond addressed as best he could without specificity. Josephine looked at Lydia across the table with her steady, intelligent eyes and then smiled, a real smile, the full version, not the managed one, and said, "Good." It was, for Josephine, the equivalent of a speech. The pregnancy went well. Lydia was not a woman who was incapacitated by physical difficulty as a general matter, and she was not incapacitated by this, though she was sick in the mornings through October and November in a way that Raymond found particularly painful to witness, because there was nothing he could do about it except make sure there was always fresh water and plain biscuits, and that she was left alone when she needed to be left alone, which was a form of care she was unusually able to articulate needing. He sat with her on the bad mornings, not talking. just present the way she had been present with Clara in the storm, a shelter, a steady point of reference in the unsteady. She told him once on a November morning when the sickness had been particularly bad and she was sitting on the edge of the bed with her head in her hands that she had not expected this. He asked what she meant. She looked up at him and said, "Someone to sit with me, someone who stays." He took her hands in both of his and said, "I stay." Simple and permanent, the way he meant it. Winter of 1883 into 1884 was cold and still, and Raymond's life had a quality of abundance that he had forgotten was possible. The ranch was doing its best season in 4 years. The children were good. Thomas had turned 10 and was developing an interest in the horses that went beyond conversational, had begun to learn to ride properly and seriously, which Raymond supported with the particular pleasure of watching a child discover their competence. Josephine was 13 and reading everything she could find and had begun writing stories in a journal, which she showed to Lydia before she showed to anyone else, which Raymond counted as something significant. Clara had stopped being afraid of thunder. He was not sure exactly when it happened. Sometime in the winter, the fear simply seemed to exhaust itself, or perhaps it was that she no longer associated storms with the worst possible outcome. She had found Lydia in the storm. The storm had not taken, had brought. Perhaps her body and heart had recalculated. In April of 1884, Lydia delivered their son. The birth was attended by the town's midwife, a capable woman named Margaret Holt, and by Raymond, who was allowed in the room because Lydia asked for him, and he did not argue with anything Lydia asked for. It was long and difficult, and the hours of it were the longest of Raymond's adult life, including the night Sarah died, because this was the opposite of that night but required the same terrible helplessness, the inability to do anything except be present and hold a hand and trust. The boy was born in the early morning, healthy and loud, with a full head of dark hair and a furious expression that seemed to reflect a passionate objection to having been displaced from somewhere comfortable. Raymond held him first in the April morning light and looked at him and felt the full sum of everything that had led to this moment. The storm, the kitchen floor, the river rock, the honey jar, the train back from Topeka, the porch in September, and could not believe the distance he had traveled from the man in the barn doorway. "What do you want to call him?" Lydia asked from the bed, tired and clear-eyed and entirely herself, as she always was. Raymond looked at the boy and then at his wife. "Samuel," he said. It had been his father's name. He had not been sure until this moment whether he would want to use it. "Samuel Bailey," Lydia said, tasting it. "Yes," a pause. "Come here." He brought Samuel to her, and she received him with the same quality he had first seen through a rain-blurred window, that ancient steadiness, that competence of holding, and he sat on the edge of the bed beside her and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they looked at their son together. After a while Josephine appeared in the doorway, cautious, with Thomas and Clara behind her, and she looked at Lydia with Samuel and her father's arm around Lydia and said nothing for a moment. Then she said very quietly, "Can I hold him?" "Come in," Lydia said. Josephine came in and sat carefully on the chair beside the bed, and received Samuel with the serious, focused care of someone who understood the full weight of what they were holding. Thomas crowded in beside her, looking at Samuel with an expression that was half wonder and half the 9-year-old's complicated relationship with babies. Clara climbed directly onto the bed without asking, which was Clara's way, and pressed close to Lydia's side, and looked at Samuel with the uncomplicated delight she had had since September. Raymond looked at all of them, this collected, improbable, beloved family in the April morning light, and felt nothing like the man who had managed things. Felt everything like the man he had been on the way to being all along, if he had only found the right person to be there when the thunder came. Merritt Hale was convicted in the spring of 1884 in the federal court on 7 counts. Henry Foss sent a brief, professional letter informing Lydia of this outcome. She read it at the kitchen table, set it in the center of the table like it was something that needed to be seen in proper proportion, and then looked up at Raymond and said, It's finished. He sat down across from her. Samuel was in the cradle by the window, 4 weeks old, making the small sounds of a baby who is not yet sure what the world is, but is provisionally interested. Outside the kitchen window the spring was advancing on all fronts, the cottonwoods in bud, the creek running full and clear, the grass coming green over the amber of last year's growth. "All of it," he said. "All of it," she said. "Coal hail, all of it. Done." He took her hand across the table the way he had developed the habit of doing. Because he liked to be touching her, and because she liked it too, he had learned, though she had never said so in precisely those words. She had simply stopped pulling away and started leaning toward, which was the same thing in a language they had built together. "What do you want to do now?" he asked. It was a genuine question. He asked it because she had been in reaction and management and flight and survival for so long that he was curious what she looked like when none of those were required. She thought about it with the seriousness she brought to questions that deserved it. "I want to see what this land is like in every season," she said. "I've seen summer and fall and winter. I want to see it through a spring. And then I want to do it again." She looked at him with a steadiness that was no longer quite so defended, that had gentled in the months of being loved properly. "I want to watch your children grow up. I want to watch Samuel grow up. I want," she stopped, a small smile. "I want a lot." "Good," he said. "So do I." They sat in the spring kitchen with the baby sleeping and the land waking outside. And Raymond thought about a night of rain and a barn doorway and a woman on a kitchen floor. And he thought about how much had been at stake in that moment that he had not known was at stake. How the particular quality of Lydia's tenderness toward his frightened child had cracked him open in a way that nothing else had, and how that cracking had admitted everything else. The love and the help and the risk and the marriage and the son sleeping in the cradle and all the seasons she had just said she wanted to live. He had been afraid of being undone. He had spent 2 years managing himself against precisely that vulnerability. And the thing that had finally undone him had turned out to be the beginning of being remade. Josephine was 13 and already the best student in her class at the small Caldwell school. And the circuit teacher, a young man named Grover who took his work seriously, told Raymond in the late spring of 1884 that she was reading at a level that exceeded what Caldwell could offer, and that he should consider what options existed for her education. It was a conversation that Raymond and Lydia had together at the kitchen table that evening, and that Josephine was included in because she was 13 and it was her future. "There is a women's academy in Topeka," Lydia said. She had apparently done the research already, which Raymond had not asked her to do but was not surprised by. "Day program and boarding both. The boarding is expensive but not impossible." Josephine looked between them. "You would let me go?" "If you want to go," Raymond said, "it's your choice. But you would let me." "We would help you," Lydia said. Josephine was very still for a moment. She had the habit of stillness when something mattered enormously, which was also, Raymond had realized, a thing she shared with Lydia. They had more in common than either of them had originally supposed, which had turned out to be true of most things between them once they stopped being cautious. "Not yet," Josephine said. "I want to be here for a while yet." She looked at Samuel's cradle. "A while yet, and then maybe." "Then maybe," Raymond agreed. "It will be there." Thomas found in 1885 that his interest in horses was not simply conversational. He had a genuine gift with them, a patience and a physical ease in the relationship that Jim Carver recognized professionally and pointed out to Raymond with the plain admiration of an experienced man recognizing something real in a young one. Raymond began teaching Thomas seriously, ranch work in earnest, the kind of teaching you do when you believe someone has the foundation for the work and not just an enthusiasm about it. Thomas at 11 was already more confident on horseback than most adults, and Raymond watched him working the horses in the south pasture one summer evening with a quality of pride that was almost overwhelming, and thought that this was what it looked like when children became themselves. Clara, at 7, was cheerful and social and apparently afraid of nothing. The thunderfear had gone, and in its place was a child who ran at the world with a directness that had a little of Lydia in it, and a little of Thomas's warmth, and something entirely her own. She had attached to Samuel with the possessive delight of a child who has been the youngest and is now, thrillingly, not, and she took the responsibility of being an older sibling with a solemnity that was frequently also very loud. Lydia, in 1885, planted fruit trees along the south fence of the ranch house yard. 3 apple, 1 pear, 1 plum. They were small trees, barely more than whips, and they would take years to bear. Raymond stood and looked at them when she had finished setting them and understood what they meant. They meant she was not going anywhere, not planning to, not hedge against it, simply not. The trees were a statement of permanence made in the language of growing things, which was the kind of language the frontier understood better than any other. "It'll be a few years before they bear," he said. "I know," she said, brushing dirt from her hands. "We'll be here." He pulled her in and kissed her right there in the yard in the afternoon, which was the kind of thing he did now without thinking about it, and she put her hand on his jaw the way she did and kissed him back. By 1886, Samuel was 2 years old and possessed of a personality that had apparently been in reserve, waiting until he could walk and therefore deploy it at full speed, and which turned out to be a combination of his father's quiet stubbornness and his mother's precise directness, arranged in a package that was charming, exhausting, and completely impossible to resist. He followed Lydia through the house with the devotion of a duckling, and called her Mama with the assurance of someone who has never had reason to question the arrangement. He called Raymond Papa, and demanded to be taken to see the cattle at a frequency that Raymond indulged more often than was strictly advisable because Samuel's delight in the cattle was specific and inexhaustible, and Raymond found it deeply entertaining. Lydia told Raymond in the summer of 1886 that she was expecting again. She told him the same way she had told him about Samuel, directly, on the porch, watching his face. He responded the same way he had then, holding her, though this time he also laughed, which surprised him and pleased her. Their second child, born in February of 1887, was a girl. They named her Rose, after no one in particular, simply because when Lydia held her in the winter morning light, she looked like the word rose in the way that some things simply look like their right name. Samuel, at 2.5, approached Rose with the careful, solemn inspection of a young scientist, and ultimately pronounced her acceptable, which made Lydia laugh until she cried, which was how Raymond knew she was actually fine after the birth. Josephine left for the Topeka Women's Academy in the fall of 1887, at 15, after 2 years of the mentioned and deferred possibility had ripened into readiness. She went with 1 trunk, 17 books, and the contained but genuine emotion of a girl who knew exactly what she was doing and was doing it because she had been given the space to become someone who knew what she wanted. She shook Raymond's hand at the train platform with a formality that was unmistakably hers, and then briefly, fiercely, hugged him, which was less usual and more true. Then she turned to Lydia. They looked at each other, these two, this 15-year-old girl and this 34-year-old woman who had come into each other's lives sideways and had built something that was its own particular structure. Not mother and daughter as birth makes that, but something equally real and considerably harder one. Lydia pulled Josephine into a proper embrace, which Josephine allowed and then returned with a tightness that communicated exactly what she would not say, because she was Josephine and feelings were things you had privately. When they separated, Lydia put her hands on Josephine's face briefly and said, "Write to me, not just your father, me." "I will," Josephine said, and she did. Every 2 weeks, regular as the mail allowed, a letter that was long and detailed and intellectually alive, and frequently made Lydia read passages aloud to Raymond at dinner, because the pleasure of them was too good to keep to herself. The apple trees bore fruit for the first time in the fall of 1887. Not much, small and irregular, the first offering of a young tree still finding its full power. But real, actual apples, red and slightly tart, and Lydia made a pie with them, and Raymond ate 2 slices, and said it was the best pie he had ever eaten, which was both probably true and also an expression of something that was not entirely about the pie. They stood at the kitchen window that evening, the September light coming gold again the way September always did, Samuel asleep already and Rose in her cradle, Thomas somewhere with the horses and Clara with a friend in town, the house quiet in the way that houses are quiet when everyone in them is well and accounted for. 4 years ago, Raymond said. She looked at him, knew exactly what he meant. 4 years ago there was a storm, he said. And I was in my barn, soaked through, and you were in my kitchen with Clara. She was looking at him with the soft, undefended version of her face that she had learned to wear with him, the version that wasn't armor. I was undone, he said. Standing in the doorway watching you hold her, I was completely undone and I did not know yet what it meant. She turned toward him fully. What did it mean? He looked at her, this woman who had walked through a storm to comfort his child, who had carried a dark past and laid it down, who had told him the truth from the beginning, who had stayed and planted trees and built something real out of difficult material, who had given him Samuel and Rose, and given Josephine a friend she had not known she needed and given Thomas patience and Clara steadiness, and who looked at him every day as an equal directly, without performance. It meant, he said, that you were going to be the most important thing that ever happened to me. Lydia Garrison Bailey looked at her husband in the September kitchen with the sound of the land outside and the children in the house around them, and she put both her hands on his face the way she did, the gesture that was entirely hers, and she said, "Well, you were not wrong about that." He kissed her. The apple trees in the yard held their small, improbable fruit. The cottonwoods by the creek whispered their silver sound. The land went on in all directions, amber and endless, as it always had, as it would for a long time yet, holding the weight of everything they were building on it, all the seasons still to come. Josephine came home for Christmas of 1887 with 3 new books and a sharper mind than she had left with, and the beginning of an intention to teach, which she announced over Christmas dinner with the composure of someone who has thought it through completely and is informing rather than requesting. Thomas, at 13, had taken on a role on the ranch that was genuinely useful rather than honorary, working the horses with a competence that made Jim Carver say to Raymond privately that the boy was going to be exceptional. Raymond told Thomas this directly, without embellishment, because he was his father's son in the matter of plain speaking, and Thomas turned red and then looked at the horses and said, "They make it easy." Clara, at 10, was reading everything she could get her hands on, having apparently inherited the family's literary habits from Josephine's example and Lydia's encouragement, and was of the firm opinion that Rose was the most perfect baby ever produced, which made Samuel deeply indignant and therefore kept the household lively. Samuel, at 3, was discovering language in the thorough and relentless way of children who have a lot to say and are just waiting for the vocabulary, and he said everything twice for emphasis, and called the ranch hands by their first names with the ease of a child who has been welcomed everywhere, and he had Raymond's dark hair and Lydia's brown eyes, and a grin that appeared without warning and made even Jim Carver's weathered face do something warm. In the spring of 1888, Raymond expanded the ranch's south pasture, bringing in additional cattle and taking on another 2 hands, and the operation was soundly profitable in a way that he could measure against the drought years, with the satisfaction of someone who has survived something difficult and come out the other side. He bought Lydia a proper horse, a good bay mare, steady and quick, with a mouth that was honest and a personality that Lydia approved of immediately, which was the main qualification, and she learned to ride with the same direct competence she brought to everything. They rode out together on Sunday mornings sometimes, when the house was managed by older children who were increasingly capable of the management, and those mornings on horseback across the ranch land, were something Raymond counted among the best hours of his life. The two of them side by side on the open prairie, the land extending in every direction under the enormous sky, talking or silent as the mood required, equal and unhurried, belonging to no one's expectation, simply themselves. He thought sometimes on those mornings about the years before Lydia, and he could see them clearly, not without value, because they had contained his children and his work and his survival, all of which mattered but emptier, in a way that he had not been able to perceive from inside them. Grief had narrowed him. She had widened him back. Not by filling the space that Sarah's loss had left, that space had its own nature and always would, but by making the whole structure bigger, so that everything fit differently, more generously, with more room for what was actually true. By 1889, the apple trees were bearing properly. Lydia made preserves and pies, and a fall cider that became something of a local commodity. Pete Marsh asked if she would supply the general store with jars of the apple preserves. And she did, with a business directness that Raymond found enormously attractive, setting a price that was fair and firm and not apologetic. The Henderson property, which she still owned, she had rented to a young couple from Ohio who were attempting a kitchen garden operation, and the rental income added to the household accounts in a way that was Lydia's own independent contribution to the family's financial foundation, which she cared about in a way that he had come to understand was not about distrust of him, but about her own integrity. She needed to be a contributor, not a dependent, because that was who she was. Josephine wrote from Topeka in the spring of 1889 that she had completed her formal studies and had been offered a teaching position at a small school in a growing town called Pratt, in western Kansas. She was 20 years old and fully formed, and the letter was characteristically composed and clear, and the last paragraph, almost casually, mentioned a young man named Eli who was a land surveyor and who she was finding good company. Raymond read this last paragraph to Lydia, and Lydia smiled and said, "Good company. Coming from Josephine, that is practically a declaration." Raymond wrote back that they were glad she was well, and that Pratt was a growing town with good prospects, and that Eli sounded like someone he would like to meet. He added that the apple trees were doing excellently, and that Rose was walking and had begun to demonstrate opinions, and that Samuel had named 3 of the cows and was not entertaining any disagreement on the subject. He added at the end that they were proud of her, which he had said before and would say again, because it was permanently and completely true. The summer of 1889 was warm and generous, and Raymond's land produced well, and his children were healthy, and his wife was, he thought one evening on the porch, watching her in the yard with Rose on her hip and Samuel crouched, examining something in the grass with intense scientific focus. The fact of her in his life was still something that produced in him a quality of gratitude that verged on astonishment, not the managed gratitude of someone who counts blessings as a discipline. The involuntary astonishment of someone who knows exactly how close they came to none of it. A storm came in August of 1889. A real one, big and sudden, the kind that came up from the southwest and moved fast and through the sky into the dramatic performance that Kansas storms specialized in. Raymond was in the barn. He was often in the barn when storms came, checking the animals, checking the door, the old habit, and he looked at the house through the rain and saw the lantern light in the kitchen window. He crossed the yard in the rain and came in through the kitchen door. Samuel was at the table doing something with a set of wooden blocks he was never very far from. Rose was in Lydia's arms, not from fear. Rose was not afraid of storms. Rose at 2 found them mildly interesting, but simply because Lydia had picked her up, the way she picked up babies, the way she held children with that ancient natural ease that had first undone him 7 years ago. Lydia looked up when he came in, rain-soaked and muddy-booted, standing in the doorway, and she looked at him with that look that was all hers, direct and warm and completely real. "You're soaking," she said. "I know," he said, "Take your boots off," she said. He came further into the kitchen and bent to his boots and then straightened and looked at his wife with his daughter in her arms and his son at the table. And outside the storm did its work, and the lantern burned steadily against it. And he was not undone now, not the way he had been the first time. He was the opposite. He was so fully built, so completely himself, so entirely present in the life that had happened to him, and that he had chosen and that had chosen him, that the storm outside was simply weather. He crossed the kitchen and kissed Lydia's temple, and then Rose's forehead, and then went to sit at the table with Samuel and the wooden blocks and said, "What are you building?" "Ranch," Samuel said with 3-year-old certainty. "Same as Papa." Raymond looked at his son. He looked at Lydia. She was watching him with that expression that meant she had taken in all of this, the kitchen, the storm, the family, all of it, and was feeling the full weight of it and was glad. "Good," Raymond said to Samuel. "A ranch is a good thing to build." Outside, the thunder rolled east toward the horizon, already moving on. Inside the kitchen, the lantern burned, and the family gathered around its light. And the land that they had planted and worked and loved went on in all directions under the storm-washed Kansas sky, patient and enormous and entirely, permanently theirs. Josephine came home in December of 1889 with Eli, who turned out to be a quiet, steady young man of 25 with an engineer's precise mind and a genuine kindness about him that Raymond recognized within 10 minutes of shaking his hand. He was not performative or obvious about the kindness. It was simply the operating framework underneath everything else. Raymond approved of him completely and said so to Lydia that night, and Lydia said, "I know." I approved of him within the first hour. And then, with the small private smile that was one of his favorite things about her, "Josephine has good taste. I wonder where she learned that." Josephine and Eli married in the spring of 1890 in a ceremony that took place in Caldwell, and the whole family assembled for it. Thomas, at 16, already tall and easy in the way of people who know where they belong. Clara at 12 with her mother's brown eyes and her father's serious jaw. Samuel at 5 in a too-new suit making friends with everyone in the room. Rose at 3 being held most of the time by one person or another, because she was still at the age where being held was a basic operating requirement. Raymond stood at the edge of the church gathering and watched Josephine. Watched her standing with Eli, the contained brightness of her, the composed and genuine happiness that was so typically Josephine felt in full, expressed precisely, not performed for an audience. He thought about a 12-year-old girl at a breakfast table with her mother's eyes telling him about a woman in town. He thought about how long and complicated the road between that morning and this one had been, and how much of what had made it good had been Lydia, and how much of what Josephine had become had been allowed to become because Lydia had been there. He found Lydia at his shoulder with Rose on her hip. She had been watching him watch Josephine. "She's extraordinary," Lydia said. "She is," Raymond agreed. "She always was." "She gets that from you," Lydia said. He looked at her. "She gets a fair amount of it from you." Lydia looked back at Josephine with an expression that was soft and entirely honest. "Maybe," she said. "Maybe we all helped." A pause. "I think that's the best version, that we all helped." He put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, and Rose reached for his collar with a small imperative hand, and he caught her fingers and she laughed. The years of the early 1890s were the years of accumulation and deepening. Thomas took on increasing responsibility on the ranch and showed an aptitude for the business side of it, the negotiations, the market calculations that complemented his physical gift with the horses. And by his 18th year, Raymond could see clearly that the ranch had its future in his eldest son's competent hands. Clara went to Topeka for her own academy year at 15 and came back with intentions about medicine that surprised everyone except Lydia, who said, "She has always wanted to know how things work inside. That is simply where it went." Raymond thought about that for a while and decided Lydia was right, as she frequently was in these observations, and wrote letters to find out what paths were available to women who wanted to study medicine in 1893, which were not many but were not none. Samuel grew into the ranch the way Thomas had grown into the horses, naturally, fully, with the ease of someone whose life fits them. He had Raymond's capacity for plain speaking and Lydia's direct intelligence and a social ease that was entirely his own. And by the time he was 10, he was already developing the relationships with the neighboring ranchers and townspeople that would define his adult life in this place. Rose, the youngest of them all, turned out to be the family's poet, not in any formal sense but in the sense that she saw and felt things in a particular way, and the words she used for them were always slightly more precise and strange and beautiful than expected. Lydia encouraged this with the careful, non-intrusive generosity of someone who recognizes a particular kind of mind and knows that the best thing you can do for it is leave it room. Raymond Bailey, in the spring of 1894, stood at the fence of the south pasture in the morning and looked at his land, which was well watered and full of cattle and bounded on all sides by evidence of decades of work, and he thought about the calculation his life had made, the losses and the gains, the grief and the love that had come after it, the woman who had walked through a storm to hold his frightened child, not because she owed it to anyone, but because it was simply what she did, the way she was made. He heard her coming down the path from the house. He could hear her footsteps. He had learned them over 12 years, the particular rhythm of her walk that was direct and purposeful and also somehow light, and he did not turn around until she was at his shoulder. She had Rose by the hand. Rose was 7 and still at the age of morning hand-holding, which would not last but was currently a delight, and she had a cup of coffee for him in her other hand, which she gave him without ceremony. "Samuel is trying to saddle his horse alone again," she said. "How's he doing?" "Better than yesterday," a slight smile. "He's going to manage it soon. He's very determined." "He gets that from you," Raymond said. She looked at him sideways. 12 years and you are still saying that. 12 years and it is still true." Rose tugged at Lydia's hand and pointed at something in the pasture, one of the calves, doing something calf-like and improbable, and Lydia looked and laughed. And Raymond stood in the spring morning with his coffee and his wife's laugh and the sound of the land around him, and thought that this was not a life he had managed. This was a life he had been given, partly by circumstance and partly by courage, hers and his both, and had received with everything he had. He turned to look at her. She was pointing something out to Rose now, both of them watching the calf with the pleased attention of people who find the world genuinely interesting. The morning light was on her hair, which had a few silver threads in it now that had appeared in recent years and that he found. He had told her so once, and she had looked at him with the expression that meant she was deciding whether to take him seriously, and then taken him seriously. He found them beautiful. They were part of the account of her life, those threads. The Missouri years and the fear and the dark past set down and the seasons on this land, all of it was her. She looked over at him and found him watching and gave him that look, the direct, warm, entirely real one, the one that still stopped something in his chest just slightly the way it had the first time. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just looking." She shook her head at him in the way that meant she knew exactly what he was doing and had made her peace with it, and turned back to the calf and Rose. Raymond Bailey drank his coffee in the spring morning of 1894, on the land that was his and hers, with the children in the house behind them and the generations of it stretching forward in a way he could feel, and he was not undone. He was the opposite of undone. He was built, fully and finally, from everything that had happened, from the storm and the doorway and the woman on the kitchen floor, from the river rock and the honey jar, and the truth she had given him and the love they had made together. He was entirely, permanently, gratefully made. The cottonwoods by the creek put out their new leaves, green and silver and trembling in the morning breeze. The cattle moved in the pasture. The apple trees in the yard were in early blossom, white and brief and returning without fail, as they always did, as they would for years still to come. The land held all of it and always would, patient and enormous and full of everything they had planted in it. The trees, the work, the children, the love, all of it growing in the deep Kansas soil, rooted and real and belonging to no storm, no past, no fear that had ever tried to take it. It was, Raymond Bailey thought, exactly enough. It was, in fact, everything.